we started to talk about themes a little bit, and with this book, they say a book's only supposed to have two themes, or only supposed to have one theme, but my book, I really had two things in mind when I was writing this, and one is the concept of slavery and rescue from slavery, and so that you see that play out in the book, but also there's in captives, sometimes it's just being held against your will. And so Raquel, she was held against her will on the ships, and but she wasn't able to tell them everything at first. But as you go throughout the book, there's an initiative to see about releasing some captives, and that will happen more in book two as well. But the other thing though is fatherhood, and it might have been a little subtle, but in this story, a lot of these characters don't have fathers, or their father is not present, or they don't have a nice father. And so Nilo's father died 5 years before the story began. He was a good father, but it's been hard to cope ever since then. On the other hand, some of the people in the stories have fathers, but many of them don't have them present, and the biggest reason is because 3 years earlier the king led an expedition of most of the fighting men of the island, over 1,000 men. They left the island and went on this expedition and never came back. And so a lot of people's fathers and husbands and brothers and sons left, and they don't know what happened, because they were hoping to be back within a year or so, and they didn't come back, and nobody knows what happened to them. So as they go throughout, they find that many places they go, the women are having to fill in for the men and in task. Now, some of these women also probably were doing this a long time ago, but they were doing it right along, because this society does have a lot of freedom for women. But but you see that it's acceptable for women to do things if they have a knack or a desire to do them. But in many cases, you also see women that are kind of forced to take over for their husbands or their fathers when they left. And to hold the fort down for a little while is one thing, but it's really telling on the island for these men to have been gone for so long. But you see people jumping in there and doing what they have to do when they must. And you go back into the Bible, and one of my favorite accounts in the Bible is of Deborah. And Deborah was a woman leader in Israel, and the men came to her, and when they had problems, she was what they call a judge, which is not necessarily what we think of a judge today, but it may have had some of that. But she led them out to battle, and the Lord was in that, because there was not a courageous man who was willing to fill that role and take the leadership at that time, and somebody had to do it. And you see that several other times in the Bible. And honestly, I think good stories can come of things like that, because it's part of what makes a book interesting, is seeing people do things that they weren't expecting to have to do.
Everybody ends up doing something that they didn't plan on having to do, and to be able to hear stories of people who step up and do that,
right, yeah. So anyway, I've really enjoyed writing this book, and I'm looking forward to continuing with the series. I can't wait to read the rest of your books. I've ordered the fourth one, and so we've got the two more after that, and then you're still writing the seventh one, I guess.
Yes, I've been stuck about a quarter of the way through for the last year or so, just because life has been so busy.
Oh, I can relate. And absolutely. You and I think, have both moved in the last couple of years, and it's a process. And besides that, there's so much else going on. And it took me forever to write Nilo. I started on it about 4 or 5 years ago, and I shelved it because of everything I was dealing with.
Mm.
And I came back to it, I guess about a year ago. It took me about a year once I got back to it, and then I stuck with it. And um, but I'd been thinking about it off and on during that time though, and so a lot of the things that I came that came out in the story, I kind of knew about where I wanted to go with it before, but it and of course, when the second one comes out, it's going to complete this much better. So the two will really go together very nicely. But I I had time to just think about it over a long period of time, and some of the characters and things that I hadn't come up with yet when I first started writing it actually were the result of percolating for years as
Mhm.
I would just think about it from time to time. You're
Yeah,
not supposed to write that way, but it happened. So,
my process, I usually have kind of a rough outline. Um, I hear in author circles people talk about being a uh, plotter or a pantser, I think is what they call it, going by the seat of
yep,
your pants, or very meticulously planning everything out. But I
right.
heard of one in the middle that's called a plantser. So you plant ideas and then without fully fleshing them out, and then just seeing how they grow as they go along. So that's kind of, I think, what I do, because I have an outline. I know where I want to get to from point A to point B and things that want to happen in between, but a lot changes and gets fleshed out as I go through the process of writing.
I really do the best that way. Now, my mom is more of a plotter, and so when we wrote the two books together, and we are hoping to write at least one more, but again, it's been a matter of there's certain reasons we just haven't been able to get together and write a third one yet. But she loves to plot it out, and that's fine. That works well for her. And when I'm working with her, it's that's how we do it, and it's fine. But I do more like you said. I I do one thing I do is I make an Excel file and I make a timeline. And so when I say they did something, I make sure I know what day they did it on and how long, I don't want it to get in a situation where suddenly I said they did something that they could not have done, because it actually takes longer than that to ride a horse from one place to another. You know,
Yes.
you can't, you, that's how I stay intellectually honest with myself. I try to plot it, and that way, if later in the story they have to talk about something that happened before, then I can look back and say, yep, that happened on that day. And so this other new plot twist can't have happened then because it wasn't ready for that yet. So I have to I try to keep myself out of holes that way. By sometimes I found authors write something, I'm like, how in the world did they get from London to Paris in one day back in Charles Dickens' time or something? I don't think that was possible, or something,
Mhm.
or something like that. And you just like, how did that girl's broken leg heal in just 2 weeks? I don't think so. And you find these plot holes, and I try to keep. That's one thing I try to do is keep my timeline and know how long it took for things to happen. But that's mostly kept me out of trouble that way. But I don't know. I don't know if you do anything like that.
Yes, it's not necessarily to the day. It depends on the story, but the book 6, Captain of the Sand, did have to do that to write out exactly what was happening each day with the different storylines and how long it was going to take, because I had a lot of people moving back and forth for different
Yeah,
things. And it's like, are they really all going to be at this place at the same time or not? Because
right.
they're all going doing all these other things.
Yeah,
Um,
and absolutely. And we had to do that for sure with the seafaring women, because like you were talking about wind charts and things, we had to study how long it would take that ship to go up the coast of Australia. And were they going with the wind, against the wind, the current, all that stuff. What are the Sometimes the crazy thing about a sailing ship is that and I think I saw you write about this in one of your books too, is that depending on the conditions, it can be a totally different trip, and you can make
Mhm.
a certain trip in 2 days that other times will take you 2 weeks to go the same distance. And so you have to pay attention to things like that and ask, is this plausible for them to get there by this date?
Yeah.
And what might have, what would be typical, you know? Same thing when you're riding camels or horses or anything else. How often do these animals have to stop to drink and eat and all this stuff? You know,
And you may not actually write all of that into the story, but you have to know it to make
right.
it realistic.
Horse people or dog people or you name it, if they know about a certain thing, you gotta show them that you at least took a little time to figure it out somewhat.
Mhm. I usually try, if I know I'm gonna have a certain thing featured or spotlighted in a story, I usually have somebody that's got some expertise in that area to read it once I'm done and check um uh my accuracy.
Yeah, I do that too if I can. I know that you actually know about archery, and so my dad also is big into archery, and he makes his own bows and arrows from scratch from wood. And so I have some archery scenes, and I had to ask him about the plausibility of some of the things. I don't want to spoil exactly what happens or how it's done, but one of my archers has a trick of how he has a kind of a trick bow, and there's a trick that he does that nobody can figure out how he does it until finally one day they learn. But
Mhm.
the point is, the other thing is I had to have a certain character get shot and injured but not killed, and I had to look into the plausibility of that because I know that an arrow wound, I mean, doesn't it bug you in some stories when somebody gets shot and two weeks later they're up and about, they're shot with a bullet or something, and you're like, ah, well, it was a flesh wound. I'm up and about and everything's fine 2 weeks later. No, it
Yeah,
isn't.
because even all the way up to the Civil War, millennia later than when you're writing, most people died
Right,
of infection rather than battlefield wounds.
right. So, so with this arrow wound, without spoiling exactly what happened, I wanted I know that some bows could be a lot more powerful than that, and it would have been a dead person. So I didn't want to have it be totally unbelievable. So I did ask my dad about it, and he said, under the circumstances, if the person that shot it was using a bow that was more of a smaller, like a small game bow that they used, a smaller bow for various reasons, easier to carry around, and this essentially was, an assassin. So he also has an ego. The assassin has an ego, and he doesn't want to do things the easy way. He's kind of like an evil Robin Hood as far as he can't do it the easy way. He's got to prove to himself that he's one up and to everybody around. So he's not just gonna shoot people with a bow, he's gonna shoot people with the lightweight bow.
A longbow, you have to be standing up basically to be
Right. He's got a
here.
smaller bow that's easier to carry around and not get in the way. So those shorter bows, um, they're not as powerful. And so he always goes for a kill shot, like in the throat or in a area or the heart. But he always he's meticulous. He can put a shot right where he wants it. And something happened, and it fouled up what he did. But I had to see that to make sure that it was plausible that he could have made that shot, and what happened caused it to not have the person die.
Mhm.
And so my dad said, yeah, yeah. Now, if it had been like an English longbow, no, it would have gone, have been so dead. You teach archery, don't you?
Yes, I coach with the National Archery in Schools program with my fourth and fifth graders.
Yeah.
So, um,
So it's, the archery shows up well in your books too, I think. But at least, and I hadn't remembered that you were doing that. But yeah, I don't do much myself, but I ask my dad when I have questions about archery whether something would work or not.
mm,
And even like distances, people think somebody can shoot accurately with a bow at 100 yards. Well, if how accurate is accurate? Most people can't shoot somebody at 100 yards with a bow, and it would be one of those English longbows if they could.
Mhm. Well, and if they could, it would be somebody who practiced it all the time, and that's all that they did.
Right.
For Captain of the Sand, I researched slingshots a little more.
Mm.
I had some of them in A Crack in the Rock, but I did some research where cultures who use slingshots all the time, the people who practice can get really good at them, and you can have really good accuracy from a pretty long range, but you have to practice it all the time in order to
Now,
be
I
good.
I don't know if you caught it, and I don't want to say too much, but one actually showed up in my book too. I
I
don't know if
think
you.
yeah, I think I remember something about that.
Yes. Okay, so not to spoil it too much, but that's actually going to become much more important in book two.
Yeah.
And so yeah, and it's if you like to get into the Bible and read the story of David, of course, you know that David is famous for using the sling,
Hmm.
and so there's a lot in my story that should remind you of the story of David. And as you get into book two, you're going to see even more of that, and it's going to be more obvious why. But the sling does come into to play in my book too.
And I practiced just a little bit with the sling, and I'm not very good at it.
So my dad actually had a sling like we're talking about. Now there's actually two kinds of slings. That there's like the Y-shaped one, but the one that David used was more of the one that was not, it didn't have a solid piece. Yeah, you swing it around over your head and let go one end and the rock goes flying. So that's the kind that David would have used, and that's the kind in my story and in your story too, I believe.
Yeah.
But it's real fun. But yeah, I got to where I could probably get within 10 degrees of where I meant it to go. But that's
That's
when
pretty
you
good.
consider 360 it's going around. I mean, I probably got within about 10 degrees. But it's so much easier to just use a BB gun.
Well, I'm much better actually at throwing a dagger or an axe than I am the slingshot. That's another one of those things I had to experiment with to see. You always see these people in the movies just throwing this dagger
Oh,
across with there.
it,
Is
it
that
just automatically works, doesn't it?
right? Without any practice at all. Yeah. So,
No, and there you've got me one up because I have tried that, and I never had anybody to properly teach me, but I couldn't get. And then I bought some actual throwing knives years ago, and I did better than with a regular knife, but it was like maybe one out of, I might have gotten to 20% stick rate, and I couldn't see any improvement, and I didn't know, I kind of gave up on it. But yeah, that is actually much harder than people make it look like.
another thing you have to practice a lot. Yes. I didn't want to use throwing knives in my stories because people didn't actually carry those around. Most people carried a dagger or something to cut their food with and to eat with, like a fork. So it was a handy utensil that almost everybody had, and was not necessarily balanced for throwing. But a dagger spins end over end, so you have to know your distance and either take a step forward or step back to be able to time it to where it's going to stick. So again, lots of practice.
Yeah, and that's something that you have to get to where you get a good feel for it, I think.
Mhm.
And if you talk about an axe, I have tried throwing. Oh, that handle flips in such a way that if you don't have it just right, it is not going to work. That handle will hit before the head does, and that will just make it bounce back the other direction.
Yep. Yeah, same thing with the dagger. Yeah.
Yeah, that does help if the blade is well, the weighting, if it's weighted for throwing, it does make it a lot easier, but even so, it's not automatic by any means.
Mhm. But
But
it is possible. So I
yeah,
try to, if I do have somebody using a weapon, I try to make it clear that they have had plenty of practice with it.
Yeah.
My goat herders in the mountains of in the granite mountains of Brush over here, they get lots of practice with the slingshot, similar to David with his sheep up there,
Yep.
protecting the goats from the mountain lions and things like that.
Right.
Stay tuned for more episodes of Cousin to Cousin. Find our books on Amazon and Kindle.